Let's talk about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. We often hear these words lumped together or used interchangeably. Let's talk about what they mean. What are stereotypes? What is prejudice? And what is discrimination? Stereotypes are beliefs that people have about the characteristics of an entire group of people. For example, when someone says that the elderly are bad drivers or women are emotional, these are stereotypes. They are associating entire groups of people, like elderly and women, with certain characteristics, being bad at driving or being emotional. For example, a male who believes that all women are nurturing might not take the time to get to know the women he encounters and instead just make that assumption. Assumptions do not take into account or recognize that everyone is unique and they all have their own traits and attributes. Prejudice is an affective emotional state that occurs when someone has an attitude about someone else because of their demographic, group, or membership. Generally, prejudice involves negative attitudes or emotions such as feelings of anger, dislike, or even hatred against a particular group and its members. It can be positive in some cases. Sometimes people have a positive feeling about others because of their demographic group membership. For example, someone might go to a gym that is specific to women or a business that gives a discount to people in a certain age group. Examples of negative prejudices include things like ageism, racism, sexism, and homophobia. While stereotypes are specific beliefs like all men are strong, prejudice is an overall feeling or attitude like I hate this group of people. Behavioral components of intergroup relations are where the discrimination part is. This involves acting negatively towards another person or people because of their group membership, treating people differently and generally more poorly because of the group to which they belong. This might involve calling someone names, bullying them, or refusing to hire them because of their age, race, gender, or sexual orientation. Here we have a video that will be linked below. It is a little older of a video, but it does show an interesting example of a staged bike theft and the reactions to that theft. Think about this video. Which two demographic characteristics were addressed in the video, and how did people react to each different person stealing the bike? Passers-by asked the white male several questions about the bike, but never really did anything about what they were seeing. Very few bystanders tried to stop him or call the police. When the black male was attempting to cut the bike free, almost everyone who was shown walking by him was confrontational. The people reacted strongly and very differently than they did to the white male by yelling, calling the police, and taking pictures. However, when the white female was attempting to free the bike, several people offered to help. Nobody called the police, and nobody seemed to doubt her intentions at all, even though she clearly said the bike didn't belong to her. As we go through the examples we're going to use in this lecture, please understand these beliefs are not correct and we are not validating them in any way. We're just talking about the reactions in the video. Stereotypes are the beliefs we hold about different people, so many of the passers-by had stereotypes, indicating young men are more likely to be criminals, young women are weak and in need of help. Prejudice is the attitude or feeling towards someone. This is where the passers-by disliked or had negative feelings about the young black man and more positive feelings toward the young white female. Discrimination is the behavior towards someone. So this would be the calling the police and yelling at the young black man when he was trying to cut the bike free, but not doing the same to the white man or the woman, showing possible examples of discrimination. Where do stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination come from? How much influence does a person's family of origin have in this regard? Is there an intergenerational transmission of these beliefs? How much role does the media play? How about friends? How about society and culture? Do you think that one leads to the other? Do you think that stereotypes necessarily lead to prejudice, or prejudice leads to discrimination? The video showed a clear and impactful example of how people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors can be affected by demographic characteristics. Most, if not all, of the passers-by in the video likely did not even realize they were thinking about or treating someone differently specifically because of their race or gender. They just made a decision and acted. Responses happen quickly. Consider the impact of these dynamics in the workplace or in our daily life. Intergroup relations are how people think, feel, and behave towards people that are similar or different from them. Stereotypes are the cognitive or the thinking part of this. Prejudice is the negative or positive attitude or emotion that we feel, and then discrimination is the behavior. Our society is becoming more diverse, which is great. This is critical to it is also critical to health, safety, and well-being of all of us as a global community that we need to address issues related to stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination before they arise or as quickly as possible after the problem becomes known. We need to prevent future incidents. Here we'll talk about explicit prejudice, which occurs when an individual is open about and aware of their emotional biases, and implicit prejudice, which is unconscious, meaning the person who holds the prejudices is unaware that they exist. To eliminate discrimination, this is multifaceted and difficult. It's hard to eliminate because many people believe that prejudice and discrimination based on race, creed, culture, gender, age, and sexual orientation always looks the same, but that's not true. People believe all prejudice will involve having extremely negative feelings and attitudes about a particular group, that discrimination will involve obvious, overt abuse or hostility. And because of policies and laws that exist today, this is often not the way this plays out. This doesn't mean that discrimination and prejudice don't exist. It just means it's harder to identify or clarify or train around. We judge others based on two fundamental characteristics: warmth and competence. Warmth is our perception of someone else's intentions. Is the person our friend or enemy? Are their intentions good or bad? Then competence. This is our perception of how capable someone is to reach their goals. Are they effective in pursuing goals at all? Our perceptions are of someone's warmth and competence. These impact our emotional reactions and behaviors towards them. We tend to perceive these dimensions differently based on the group to which someone else belongs. Here's a chart identifying the difference between these combinations of factors. On the left, we have high warmth and high competence. We find these people approachable, we admire them, and usually this is a feeling that people have towards people that are kind of middle class. On the right-hand side, we have low warmth and low competence. We want to avoid these people. We may feel disgust, and we may experience less empathy for them. Research says that this is the usual feeling towards people experiencing homelessness. Again, we're not validating this. We're just saying the research reflects this is the case. Some of these emotional reactions seem to happen on an unconscious level, and they can color our reactions to unclear or ambiguous situations. This is how discrimination and prejudice can exist without us being aware of it. The other combinations to talk about would be high warmth and low competence. For these people, we have low expectations, we may pity them, we may act patronizing towards them, and the research says this feeling is usually towards the elderly or disabled people or differently abled people because we don't really know how to react in that situation. On the right side, we have low warmth and high competence. We feel envious of these people. We may feel nervous around them. We may admire what they have or have achieved, and we may want those things for ourselves one day. Research says this is the usual feeling we have towards high socioeconomic status people and some Asian Americans. Certain prejudices hide unconscious emotional reactions that can taint our view of people. Having an unconscious reaction of pity, disgust, or admiration could definitely color and subtly shift the decisions that we're making. This can lead to unintended discrimination. Discrimination does not have to be overt abuse or hostility. It can occur in everyday activities like performing daily tasks, during everyday interactions. It can be very subtle, but it still exists and can have a very real impact. Understanding that prejudice and discrimination can come in many subtle forms is important to overcoming these factors. We can show prejudice towards people and groups that we feel positively about, and people that we have perceptions of high warmth and low competence, like we can still display prejudice or discrimination here. We need to recognize that people from different demographic groups might experience the same situation very differently. This can be due to the assumptions that others are making about them. This can be due to the perception that others have about their level of warmth or their level of competence. Respecting and embracing individual differences and uniqueness is one way to start to overcome these factors. Also, speaking and conducting business in ways that are professional and polite are a great start. Also, we should refuse to initiate, participate in, or condone harassment or discriminatory behaviors, not sharing or engaging in offensive humor or pranks. The best rule to go by is if you have any doubt whatsoever about whether something is offensive, don't do it and don't share it. At work, you should be familiar with your company's policies and hold yourself and others accountable to them. Also, attend training to understand your legal rights and responsibilities. Reporting incidents is also important. If you see something, say something. Report incidents of harassment or discriminatory behavior that you're the witness of or that you're a victim of. Go to HR, go to your manager, go to your union if you have one, your Equal Opportunity Office, or the local Human Rights Commission if you have access to that. Here are some questions to review what we just learned. Stereotypes are the behavioral component of intergroup relations. False. Discrimination is the behavioral component. When we perceive that someone is low in competence but high in warmth, it tends to produce which of the following emotions? Admiration, envy, disgust, or pity? Pity. Stereotypes are beliefs people have about others because of the demographic group to which they belong. This is true. Discrimination always involves overt hostility and/or abuse. This is false. As we just recently discussed, sometimes this is very subtle, it is not overt, and it's hard to identify or call out. So this is why we should be aware of these things. So stereotypes are, like we discussed, beliefs that associate entire groups of people with certain traits. They can involve negative or positive traits. For example, stereotypes about women, including the idea that all women are nurturing and emotional. No matter the specific belief, stereotypes are inherently generalizations, indicating all men, all women, all white people, etc., are a certain way. Recall that in previous weeks we learned that conscious attention can only focus on one thing at a time. Some psychologists believe stereotypes might exist to free up conscious energy and attention to focus on other things. People use stereotypes to fill in gaps so they don't have to dedicate conscious attention to getting to know each person that they encounter. They can use their stereotypes to make assumptions about what a new person is like. So, for example, if you have a stereotype that all women are nurturing, you might assume your new female coworker must be caring before you even interact with her. Stereotypes can be difficult to change. Research indicates that when people encounter someone who does not fit with their existing stereotype, they will throw that new person into a separate category or subtype, rather than revising their ideas. Imagine that you have a stereotype that all women are emotional, and you meet a woman who is stoic and unemotional. Rather than changing your belief entirely, you might instead create a subtype and decide all women are emotional except for older women. Older women are unemotional. Another complication comes from what's known as confirmation bias. People tend to seek out and notice information that confirms their beliefs and ignore or minimize the importance of evidence that goes against their beliefs. Stereotypes can influence how we behave towards others without our consciously being aware of this change. So if you believe all women are emotional, you might treat women as though they are fragile and easily upset. Without realizing it, this could in turn affect how women react to you, perhaps making it seem that you're confirming your beliefs. A negative feeling towards a person based solely on the group to which they belong is prejudice. This includes racism, sexism, homophobia, and all other forms. Prejudice can be seen as summarizing the specific stereotypes a person has, forming their overall evaluation of a group of people. Since psychologists studying stereotypes and prejudice examine attitudes that people might be unwilling or unable to report, they sometimes have to get a bit creative. A research participant might be hesitant or embarrassed to admit that they dislike other races or religious groups. To try to assess attitudes people might be unwilling or unable to report, psychologists will sometimes use reaction time measures. These measures allow psychologists to see how people quickly and automatically react. If you'd like to learn more about these measures and also try some yourself, please see the following website. It's called Project Implicit, and it will be linked below. We will talk about this in a future class, and you won't need to share your results, but you will need to share your feelings about your results, if you were surprised or not. Prejudice is changing. So the Nazi experience and then the civil rights movement led to a reassessment of views, and Jim Crow racism gradually waned. And Jim Crow racism is referring to a set of laws that were state and local that enforced racial segregation and disenfranchisement in the United States from the 1880s to 1960. This required segregation in public spaces, including schools, parks, libraries, restaurants, and transportation. Signs saying whites only and coloreds were used to enforce this separation. Voter suppression tactics like literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses stopped voter participation, and interracial marriages were outlawed. Few people today believe that African Americans are biologically inferior, and few favor segregation. But that doesn't mean that prejudice has disappeared. Many scholars say that Jim Crow racism has been replaced by a more subtle form of racial prejudice termed laissez-faire, symbolic, or modern racism that amounts to an ideology that avoids notions of biological inferiority. Here's an example that you can listen to, I'll link it below, of an interview with a person who earned their PhD and experienced this strange kind of societal integration of racism. The day that Dr. Robert Montenegro finished his PhD was memorable, but not for the right reasons. He says he still cringes when he thinks about it. It started out really good. His colleagues at UCLA had taken him and his girlfriend, who is now his wife, out to a fancy restaurant to celebrate. And he was dressed up in the fanciest suit that he had at the time. His wife looked beautiful, and they were laughing as they ate, and they were excited that they didn't have to pay for the fancy dinner. He was elated and celebrating a hard-won step towards his dream of becoming a physician and scientist. There had been so many late nights and so much work, but now he had his PhD in sociology and he was headed to medical school at the University of Utah. "I felt like a king," he wrote in his article for the journal JAMA last year. And at the end of the evening, the couple got in line to pick up their car from the valet, and they were third in line, and a Jaguar pulled up to the curb. And this woman gets out of her car, and she saw the valets, and they were wearing red vests, but she passed the first couple and the second couple and got to him and handed him her keys. He says the valets looked Latino like him, and the women who wasn't assumed he was a valet too. He was so shocked he just took the keys and as she dropped them into his hand. He didn't know what to say, but he remembers turning red, and he doesn't often turn red, and he remembered his heart pounding. He remembered feeling really confused and hurt and angry. He didn't know what to say or what to do, but 5 minutes later, still standing in line, waiting for his car, it happened a second time. It happened again. Another person handed him their keys. Here he was at the pinnacle of his celebration, and with one tiny, swift action, he was dismissed. He said he was made invisible. It wasn't the first time that he had run into racist assumptions, and it wouldn't be the last. At various research conferences, academics he didn't know often tried to order drinks from him. In medical school and during his medical residency, he was sometimes assumed to be a technician at the hospital, even when he was wearing his doctor's coat. It made him question himself and made him feel confused and shocked. It was a constant reminder of feeling like he would never fit in. Now, he has a medical doctorate in addition to his PhD in sociology, and he's a postdoctoral fellow in child psychiatry at Seattle Children's Hospital. He's part of a growing group of scientists who are trying to answer some big, complicated questions. What does the repeated experience of discrimination do to your body? Could such experiences be partially responsible for health disparities that exist for different groups in America? Individually, these incidents seem benign, but cumulatively, they feel that they act like sort of a low-grade micro-trauma that can end up hurting you and your biology. It's not just about having your feelings hurt, it's having your biology hurt as well. A poll recently released by NPR reflected that roughly a third of Latinos in America report they've experienced various kinds of discrimination in their lives based on their ethnicity, including when applying for jobs, being paid or promoted equally, seeking housing, or experiencing ethnic slurs or offensive comments or assumptions. Another researcher, a social epidemiologist at the University of California, Berkeley, is working to find out how, as she puts it, racism gets under the skin. How does the lived and social experience of race turn into racial differences in health, into higher levels of type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, or higher rates of infant mortality? Let's think about that. For example, Black children are about twice as likely as white children to develop asthma, as health statistics show. Racial and ethnic gaps in infant mortality have persisted for as long as researchers have been collecting this data. People with diabetes who are members of racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to have complications like kidney failure or to require amputations. Genetics might partially explain some of these differences, but research has suggested that different populations may respond differently to some asthma drugs, for example. But that's not an adequate explanation for the persistent, dramatic differences that we see in health outcomes between racial groups. And public health researchers have found that health disparities remain even after they try to take into account any differences in income and education. Researchers hypothesize that chronic stress might be a key way racism contributes to health disparities. The idea is that by stress, or the stress of experiencing discrimination over and over might wear you down physically over time. For example, if we look back at how Montenegro remembered feeling that night when strangers assumed he was a valet, he said he turned red, his heart was pounding, and those are signs that his body was feeling acutely stressed. When you start to worry about something, whether it's race or something else, then that initiates a biological stress response. Hormones like adrenaline and cortisol shoot up, readying your body to flee or fight. These hormones can help you kick into action to escape a wild animal, for example, or to run after a bus. Under such circumstances, the ability to experience stress and quickly respond can be benign and valuable. Whatever the source of the perceived threat, the physical response, the higher levels of stress hormone, the faster heart rate, usually subside once the threat has passed. But research suggests bad things happen when your body has to gear up for threats too often, consistently washing itself in stress hormones. Prolonged elevation and circulation of the stress hormones in our bodies can be very toxic and compromise our body's ability to regulate key biological systems, like our cardiovascular system, our inflammatory system, our neuroendocrine system. It just gets us really out of whack and leaves us susceptible to a bunch of poor health outcomes. Several small studies have documented similar stress reactions in response to racism, and even in response to the mere expectation of a possible racist encounter. In studying Black women, for example, this researcher has found that chronic stress from frequent racist encounters is associated with chronic low-grade inflammation. This is a little like having a low fever all the time. They think that it might be a sign that experiencing discrimination could dysregulate the body in a way that over time could put someone at higher risk for a condition like heart disease. This kind of research is complicated. No thermometer measures degrees of racism, and it's not like scientists can take a group of people, expose some of them to discrimination, and see how they fare compared with others. Another researcher who is a biological anthropologist who is currently looking into how discrimination experiences could influence multiple aspects of stress physiology, including cortisol and heart rate variability. Unless we could experimentally assign people to racist or non-racist experiences over a life course, we can't really make causal connections. So researchers look for correlations instead of causal links. This researcher studied 55 pregnant women in Auckland, New Zealand, and found that women who said they experienced discrimination had higher evening stress hormone levels late in pregnancy than other women who didn't cite frequent discrimination. Another study at Duke University found that Black students had higher levels of stress hormones after they heard reports of a violent racist crime on campus. This connection isn't just with hormones. Other scientists have found correlations between discrimination and various measures of accelerated aging, including the tips of people's chromosomes and subtle alterations in gene activity. Individually, studies are rarely conclusive, but there are always more questions to ask. Collectively, though, they form a compelling picture of how discrimination, stress, and poor health might be related. And sometimes, in rare situations, researchers do get a slightly sharper glimpse of how such a connection might be playing out. In 2008, one example was about 900 agents with the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, including some who arrived in some Black Hawk helicopters, raiding a meat processing plant in Postville, Iowa. They were looking for people who were working illegally in the U.S. "You could time exactly when it happened," said one behavioral scientist at the University of Michigan who studied this event. "It was a surprise, and it was extreme." According to some witnesses, the agents handcuffed almost everyone they encountered who looked Latino. They ended up arresting more than a tenth of the town's population, detaining many for days at a fairground. According to a California representative who chaired a congressional hearing on this raid, detainees were treated like cattle. The information suggests that the people charged were rounded up, herded into an arena, prodded down a cattle chute, coerced into guilty pleas, and then sent to federal prison. At this hearing, he said, "It looks and feels like a cow auction. It is not a criminal prosecution in the United States of America." The people arrested were charged with criminal fraud for knowingly working under false Social Security numbers, despite allegations of judicial misconduct and reports that few of the employees were actually guilty of that crime. People lost their jobs. People were afraid to go home in case there would be raids in their homes. They were sleeping in church pews. Some of them fled the state. And by all accounts, it was extremely stressful for the about 400 people who were arrested and their families. But the event also sent ripples through the state. Apparently, as the researchers reported this year in the International Journal of Epidemiology, it may have even affected the unborn children of some Iowa residents who were pregnant at the time. In the months after the raid, this researcher says that some Latino women that were living in Iowa started giving birth to slightly smaller babies. The research looked at birth certificates of more than 52,000 babies born in Iowa, including those born in the 9 months following the raid, and in the same 9-month period, 1 and 2 years later. They found a small but noticeable increase in the percentage of babies who weighed less than 5.5 pounds, which is the definition of what pediatricians say equals low birth weight, that were born to Latina moms. Pregnant women of Latino descent throughout the state of Iowa, including those who were U.S. citizens, including those who were not at Postville, experienced on average about a 24% greater risk of their babies having a low birth weight than they had in that very same period the previous year before the raid. Before the raid, 4.7% of babies born to white moms were low birth weight. After the raid, that number dropped to 4.4%. Meanwhile, the percentage of babies with low birth weight born to foreign-born Latino moms went up from 4.5% to 5.6%, and it went up for the babies of U.S.-born Latino moms too, from 5.3% to 6.4%. Overall, that is a difference of just a few dozen children and maybe just a few ounces underweight, but at that stage of life, a few ounces matter. That can really make a difference. Babies born small are at higher risk of dying in infancy, and they have health or developmental problems later on. Low birth weight in general is not higher in the Latino population than in the white population. In Iowa, it was not higher before the raid, and it was not higher years after the raid. But that spike that happened exactly when the raid was. It's worth noting that the effect even occurred among babies born to Latina moms who were U.S. citizens, people who shouldn't have been worried about being arrested or deported. So why did it spike? Well, there is significant research that suggests that stressful events during pregnancy can result in some complex immune, inflammatory, and endocrine pathways and can increase the risk of low birth weight. She and her colleagues think that the poor treatment of people who looked Latino to the immigration agents might have caused additional stress among women outside that immediate area. People could begin to worry that this could happen to them too, or to people they know or in their communities. And those worries alone can activate these physiological stress hormones, even if they never had a raid in their own area. Other researchers noticed similar connections. In the 6 months following the September 11th attacks in the eastern United States, babies born in California to moms with Arabic-sounding names had a higher risk of being born small or preterm than observed in that group during the same time period the year before, which is a change that did not apply to other babies born in that state. Both studies investigated the impacts of specific dramatic events, and the results were consistent. You could time exactly when it happened. We could measure before and after and see a difference. But they view such events as slivers of insight into patterns that may quietly be happening on a much larger scale among many populations. Patterns that are harder to tease out and measure, like the effects of centuries of racism against Black Americans, or a persistent series of incidents involving police brutality against minorities. They say that the cascade of stress that such events initiate sets the stage for health disparities in generations of children before they even enter the world. Through stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination are often discussed together, it's possible for parts of these components, each of these components of intergroup relations to exist on their own. For example, a person might have a negative attitude towards women, but might not allow that attitude to affect their hiring decisions at work. This person would have a prejudice towards women, but would not engage in discrimination. Psychologists believe that the human mind naturally sorts things into groups and categories, rather than considering each individual item separately. Think, for example, about when you walk through the grocery store. You don't look at each item of produce separately. Instead, your mind groups together apples, oranges, bananas. So sorting people is different than sorting objects. When we sort people based on characteristics they have in common, like race, gender, or religion, we will inherently belong to one or more of the groups. When you sort people based on race, you personally will belong to one or more racial groups. From there, psychologists believe it's normal to feel some preference and attachment to the group to which you belong. If you sort based on gender and you're a woman, it's normal to feel some attachment to other women. Though it's normal to sort people and things into categories and to feel some affection for the group to which one belongs, psychologists also believe these processes can easily lead us to an us versus them sort of mentality. In fact, research has demonstrated what has become known as the minimal group effect. This is where people show favoritism and preferential treatment towards fellow group members, even when group membership has been determined randomly. For example, when researchers use the flip of a coin to assign people to teams, people still favor their group. If given the chance, people will say disparaging things about their members of other groups and will assign points and prizes to their own group members. This research helps to demonstrate just how quickly and easily an us versus them mentality can form. Realistic conflict theory also argues that hostility, prejudice, and discrimination become even more likely when groups are competing for limited resources like jobs, money, housing, or food. Research suggests that holding negative beliefs and attitudes towards other groups helps to boost a person's self-esteem. Viewing other groups as inferior allows a person to believe that they belong to a superior group, which in turn enhances self-esteem. For example, if John believes that men are superior to women, that belief should help John feel good about himself since he belongs to the better group. Similarly, if John believes his religion is correct and others are wrong, he will feel more certain of himself and that judgment. It was once widely believed that stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination might result simply from people not knowing or being exposed to members of other groups. Contact between groups, then, should be enough to reduce intergroup hostility, right? However, we've already learned in this lecture that when people encounter someone about whom they hold a stereotype, they might treat that person in a way that helps confirm their stereotype, or they may create a subtype for that person and not change their overall belief at all. Contact alone is not enough. Instead, one way to effectively reduce intergroup hostility is to have members of different groups work together to meet some common goal. This cooperation should take place over an extended period of time and allow for friendships to develop amongst the group members. It's also crucial that the goal be one that cannot be achieved alone and requires members of different groups to work together. One way to establish this sort of sustained contact in pursuit of a goal is through a jigsaw classroom or jigsaw workplace. With this technique, each student in a classroom or person in a work group contributes to completing an assignment. For example, each student or person could be assigned to teach others in the class about a specific part of a project, and understanding each part could be crucial to the completion of the task. Research on this shows it is effective in decreasing racial prejudice and improving academic and job performance. We don't cover all of the topics in social psychology in this course. We just have a brief overview. So if you want to read more on your own, please check out this site. It's called the Social Psychology Network, and it will be linked below. Here are some topics that are covered. It's very diverse. Here are some more topics that are covered on this website. Now let's review a few questions to make sure we remember from the lecture some of the things that we learned. When Tracy is cut off by another driver, she decides that the other driver must be a jerk with a mean personality. Tracy is making a blank attribution. Internal. Research on the self-serving bias factors indicate that people who are likely to make blank attributions for their successes and blank attributions for their failures. Internal attributions for successes and external attributions for failures. Blank involves treating people differently because of a group to which they belong, while blank involves a negative feeling towards a person based solely on the group they belong to. Discrimination involves treating people differently because of a group to which they belong, while prejudice involves a negative feeling towards a person based solely on their group. Minimal group effect shows that A. People tend to favor groups to which they belong even when group membership has been determined randomly. B. People tend to favor minority groups over larger minority groups. C. People tend to favor majority groups over minority groups. Or D. People tend to favor groups to which they belong only if group membership is based on some meaningful characteristic like gender or religion. The answer is A. Minimal group effect shows that people tend to favor groups to which they belong even when group membership has been determined randomly. According to research on the actor-observer effect, when Trey sees another driver speeding, he is likely to make a blank attribution for their behavior, but when Trey is speeding, he is likely to make a blank attribution for his own behavior. Internal for someone else's behavior and external for his behavior. And which of the following is true according to research on a jigsaw classroom or workplace? It is the technique used to teach students or workers to question authority and behave disobediently. B, the technique often backfires and actually increases stereotypes. C, it helps to reduce intergroup competition but interferes with performance. Or D, it's effective in reducing stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. D, this is true. It is effective in reducing stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Thank you for listening. That concludes this video of the social psych topic.